Well, I didn't have the same experience as you with the trial. I was in college, and I have a very vivid memory of the day of the Bronco chase, as it were. When I was at home after my sophomore year of college, about to watch the NBA Finals at my parents' house, and then seeing OJ come across the screen in the Bronco, and then I have and by the way, I sort of at a certain point I lost interest in whether I wanted to watch the basketball game.
Yeah, it was a slow
I didn't even
motion.
see it through to its conclusion, so that as much as I was shocked and sort of experienced the same cognitive dissonance as everybody else based on who I knew OJ to be and how I experienced him. So I had that sort of shared experience, and then, I mean, literally almost fasting. I can't even recall paying attention at all to the case. I knew enough about it clearly that I knew enough to go home to my apartment. So that was like the end of my sophomore year in college, and then the verdict was the beginning of my senior in college. And I knew enough to be at home by myself watching the verdict on TV.
Why did you feel you needed to be home alone?
Well, one, that sort of maybe speaks to my personality. Just like I tend to be a little bit of a hermit. But I didn't have, and it's funny, I've had these conversations now. For instance, a friend of mine, not to name drop, the guy Wesley Morris, who writes for the New York Times, and he's a film critic, and he was a year below me at Yale, and we've done talks where he has this sort of, the quintessential experience of sitting in a room with 20 people, half of whom are white and half of them are black, watching this, and at whatever time of the day it was, and again, black people erupting and cheers, and white people just sitting there confused, being like, what just happened? And I'm like, oh, I didn't have that. I just remember watching it, being in touch with, frankly, what I kind of was hoping for, and seeing the reaction to the verdict, and being like, okay, I went to class.
So you had no sort of bigger picture investments or expectations?
Well, actually, I mean, but yes, my rooting interests were for him to get off, not because of me knowing much about the case. It was because of the history of injustice of African Americans in the criminal justice system, and that's what I was pulling for, without having sort of a very nuanced and/or expert view of what had actually happened, which should, again, in that way, I was in line with everybody else's ignorance. It's like I just was like, this is what I'm pulling for, based on, and by the way, I probably want him to be innocent without having spent the time to figure out if he actually is or not. That's what I recall, but like in terms of being, and also, in line with my personality, I just sort of intellectually was interested in what happened, and I was like, okay, and then that was it. It did not affect me at all beyond that. So having said that, I did at least have those shared experiences to understand what, I knew the conversation. Again, without being in touch with it more than I can remember, I understood what it was all about.
Right.
And so when this came along, there are certain things that I did fundamentally understand that from this perspective of the conversation in general, talking about things in the world, like I got what it was about. But in terms of even getting back to your word, sort of complicitness, one thing about it is clearly, when I started to think about it, yes, this is a story about race. Yes, this is a story about sort of how we invest in our heroes. But it's also, to me, it's like our complicity in creating the heroes and understanding very deeply sort of who OJ was and how we created him to be the person that he became, which shed so much light on why everyone was so confused, and invested in the trial. And, it was sort of clear to me that when you talk to people who are younger, that, if you said the name OJ, it's like, oh, he's the football player who killed his wife, kind of, or maybe he's the guy who killed his wife, or, and without any real understanding of the cultural space he once occupied, like understanding of why we sort of fell in love with him in the first place, which is so fundamental to understanding the story.
But is it possible though to separate how race shapes our heroic desires? I think about, what would have happened had he been not an African American athlete, but a white athlete in a sport where they would have that level of status, and who might be responsible for or accused of killing his wife. you know, the whole criminal justice context drops out as a trigger. So
does
what
the
would be
sense of
the,
betrayal. I mean, and I think that's the sort of, I mean, again, I mean, now that
Right, well,
I almost
that's
have to
right.
get my head back into it. I'm like, okay, right. The sense
I
that,
can see why you want to put that down after a while. That's a lot of it. It's a lot of heavy
been
material.
hard. No, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, the whole thing, the unique space that OJ occupied culturally, this is why it was so important to go back to understand how he became who he is that he was not only, yes, he was not only a black athlete, he was a black athlete who was broke through and hailed as this, white America accepted him and embraced him in a way that they hadn't other black athletes.
Yeah, no, that was an amazing part of the film, because I am actually old enough not to remember OJ's early days, but when he was at the height, the Hertz commercial, and he was so exceptional in a strange way. He was really an odd duck in the way that he crossed over, even in an era when more crossover happened. But watching your film, I was just struck. I mean, I don't know if everyone has seen every episode, but you really have to. But, the USC crowds, in the beginning, I was like, oh, okay, the 60s, okay. I mean, it was just suffocatingly homogeneous. And if you imagine what it would be like for him to be in that setting, and then given his own aspirations, because there have been many black athletes at all white schools who did not go OJ's route, so he had his own drive to imagine himself. Go ahead.
Well, no, but that was the whole idea. I mean, in some ways, he embodied this sort of American ideal of integration, and this American ideal of, and by the way, even the American dream of coming from where he came from, and if you work really hard and you're really nice, and we accept you into, our world, and then as long as you, by the way, and you act on our terms.
Right.
And so the notion that, again, he was so acceptable and so loved, that's why it's like, you're right, if he was a white athlete, it would have been the same reaction, but if he were to, if you were a different black athlete, it would be the same thing. There would still be certain and potentially the same criminal justice aspects to the case.
Right, but not the white expectation.
But not the way that he was unique. I mean, that's why this story, it's so perfect.
Right.
Because of who he was and what he embodied and his trajectory. For it to sort of end up in that space, it was very unique to his specific existence, and in a way that goes beyond race.
Yeah. You also said something that I want to pull back to, which is, you maybe because you're a hermit, right? You watched it alone, but also you did carry certain expectations about concerns about the criminal justice system, and it makes sense. People go back, if you study African American history, to go back and say, yes, there've been police brutality, but you went pretty far back. And I teach through the Great Migration regularly. Well, not as regularly as I would like, but I do get to it. And this idea of thinking about the particular way that northern urban policing structures a kind of new consciousness for Black America in the second half of the 20th century is, I think, really important. And the way you're able to express that in the film is really powerful in a way that I wasn't expecting. I wasn't expecting that kind of vivid footage. So when did you decide that you needed to go back? Really if you think about it, just after World War II, right? At what point do you think that you decided that was that you needed to tell that longer fetch in order to make this real?
I mean, honestly, when I was asked to do this, and again, first and foremost, I looked at it, sort of the reason why I took it on, after initially being reluctant to take it on, because
Right.
I thought, why does the world need to know more about this story? Like we've already talked about this,
Yeah.
over and over and over again ad nauseum, and I had nothing more I thought I could contribute to that conversation. But then from the opportunity standpoint, I was offered a canvas that was so large that sort of was the motivating principle. Like, you're offering me, initially it was a 5-hour chance to make a film,
Right.
and in some ways about whatever you wanted. I mean, it was going to be about OJ,
Right.
but it was
only
like
be so much about it.
how I saw it, and like I knew primarily it's a story about race in America. I had at a weird moment, maybe like a week or two after I sort of knew I was going to do it, where I went on my own to the Brooklyn Museum, which is near where I live in Fort Greene, in Brooklyn, and there's a Norman Rockwell painting, and it was from the 60s, and it was a painting of two white kids standing in the driveway, and their parents. One parent is like right about to, standing in the doorstep of the house, and there's a car in the driveway, and there's these two young black kids who were the first family who were coming into the neighborhood. And I just remember, sort of, looking at it and being like, oh right, it's about this. Oh, but this is about everything to do with the story of race in America. And in some ways, I couldn't go far back enough.
Right.
I could start wherever the hell I wanted. And
Yeah,
that was the exciting but daunting part about it. Now, as far as specifically then to tell a story about, both the migration to Los Angeles, but also how, certain sort of methods of policing develop.
Yeah.
It's what is actually germane to this story. And in some ways, when I knew I was telling a story that was, rooted in its ultimate divisiveness, that there was, wow, look at all these people who saw this one way, and then there's this group over here that saw this another way. And I'm not here to exert my opinion. I want to sort of lean into the divisiveness and give voice to how these people, white and black, cop and civilian, Hollywood star or not, whatever, saw this thing and got to this point. And so for me, that is fleshing out the history of the police in Los Angeles. That is sort of, by the way, also relating very fundamentally the hopes and dreams of, African Americans in terms of why they ended up in this place, what LA represented to them, because this is very much an LA story, and placing OJ in that trajectory, where he fits in that, with his hopes and dreams and aspirations vis-a-vis this place. And so that's sort of how, in terms of how far back to go, I could have gone back further, but really to me, I grounded the story very quickly in a 50-year narrative that was 1965 to 2015, with context and history, a little bit before that.
Yeah, I think that was a fantastic move, because there is something that happens after the 1960s around the assumption that the world could stay the same for, say, middle-class whites, and that they could embrace black people individually as long as they show up appropriately. And that is a post-civil rights or civil rights into post-civil rights era narrative. It's how we end up with colorblindness and the racial, hostility that underlies it, even though it's denied. So it's a perfect place to start. But even as late as the trial, I can't remember who said this, but I think it's the second to the last or the last quote episode. Someone says that they said the black resentment was shocking. Who was that? Can you remind me?
That was Peter Hyams, who is the movie director who directed OJ and Capricorn 1.
Was it? Okay, I thought it was. I thought I remembered a different guy, but whatever. But you remember this moment, obviously. You spent a lot of time figuring that out. And I thought, what would it take to explain to most white Americans what the policing of black communities has been like? Like, how could it be that this resentment could be shocking? I mean, it really does. I don't know. I don't mean to sort of fall back on the sort of, how one arrived at the architecture of doing it. Yeah.
But in some ways, the whole time aspect of it is aligned with that specific idea, which is how can you get people who don't think about something and experience something emotionally and get to experience something emotionally. And contextually, if you tried to make this film and it was an hour and a half long, it's impossible, because you'd still be sort of in some ways
telling the story
of a murder and a trial, which bores me to tears, and you have you have two lines of context. The context, it would be like, a shot of Rodney King getting beaten and a shot of OJ running a football. That's all you get. And so, no, you know what? If you spend the time and live through this history, live through these incidents emotionally that sort of dotted this landscape, that were these galvanizing moments if you were a black Angelino, and understood in some ways the daily trauma and fear that sort of people lived with. And if you could be taken through that emotionally as a white person, by the time you arrive at the trial, maybe your brain has been rewired a little bit to understand, this is what this was all about. This is why black people felt the way they did. So the idea that Peter Hyams, could look at black people celebrating and take it to a place of, one, I didn't understand why to paraphrase,
Right.
why do you hate us so much? Or,
Right.
it's just like, well, he's a lovely guy, but like he lives in Hollywood and plays golf every day at the Riviera Country Club and, lived in Brentwood near OJ. It's like he's not forced to
Right.
deal with this.
Although he had to have watched a little bit of news coverage of the Rodney King incident, right? Which that trial, which you fantastically compare, goes out to Simi Valley to basically have the same kind of bias, right? So that's what I found so powerful about the film, is that it forces us to look at the ways in which a racist system produces bias of perception on everybody's side. Now, the reasons for that bias are hierarchical, but they are nonetheless the case. I mean, there was that footage, I don't know how I'm very glad you put it in there, but when someone says, well, this may have been edited, this is the Rodney King, he's been beat to a pulp for minutes on end, I couldn't watch that, I just stuck my hand up in front of the TV screen, I was like, I watched it for what looked like years. Anyway, then someone says, we don't know, this could have been edited, we don't know what have happened before that might have justified this. I'm like, what exactly could Rodney King have done before that would justify a celebration beating? I mean, it was just went on and on. But it was so, to me, what I think is so fascinating is to think about the bias that allows a jury to say this is okay, that is still sort of uninterrogated. I mean, it wasn't your job to sort of force the hand, but, there is a sense in which, how to come to the sort of the way race is being viewed from a sort of critical lens on white viewers and the criminal justice system, was the beginning. It was sort of just getting going for that. Like, and I would, are you interested in that part of the story about telling it from that perspective in some other way, or did that come up about how to, because basically what happens in the film is white viewers can say, I get it now. Why would a rational person want OJ to get off or be excited about a tragedy? But there's also the how did I not know, and then there's what's my investment in objectivity of white jurors and white defendants.
Well, I mean, I guess all that was somewhere in my head. I think when you're saying that, I was thinking specifically about, and maybe you're referring to him. One of the sort of more, and weirdly, there aren't as many sort of shocking moments when you're out talking to people. In some ways, you have a sense of where they're coming from before you do an interview. Mm-hmm. But that sentiment came out when I was interviewing the police detective Tom Lang, who is one of the sort of main detectives in the case, basically the main detective. And by the way, pretty much the only person in some ways that wasn't sort of painted with this racist brush.
Right.
He was just a guy who did his job and and has done 500 interviews about OJ. I mean, at least, for these type of things over there. And so, we come along and he's an example of someone who's like, I don't want to do this. And you're like, why are you different? Why are you this? And you sort of have to explain what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And, and he's an honorable guy and he sits there and, we did a 4-hour interview and answered all my questions. But he, I think, relished the opportunity to talk about sort of the perspective of being a cop who, he was in the Army, how he got to become a policeman. And then we arrived at talking about, Rodney King, and he said, he's the one that said, I don't think those cops should have been prosecuted. And I just remember sitting there in the interview being like, what?
Yeah,
like kind of like, do you mean, because also in a weird way, I was like, do you mean that? Like, I'm not out to like get you here. I just want to make sure you're fully.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, and so, but again.
Are we having a truth moment or a sarcastic moment?
Right. So then it's like, from his perspective, it's like you have no idea how difficult it is to be a cop. You have no idea in that moment what is happening with this person. From my mind, there's nothing he can say to me that's going to change my thinking about sort of that. But that sort of is where I was trying to get to with the film, which is like it's not like when I was sitting down with Mark Furman, I have some sort of preconceived notion about, and again, that's a whole different conversation about how to deal with him. But it's like, he's someone who are like, this is the way he feels. Like, he's going to dig in and be protective of cops from his perspective. And then when you sort of get a sense of why we were aligned the way we were, where these viewpoints come from, this, to me, that more than anything else, speaks to that. Yeah. Because I can't get inside That's the sort of divisiveness standpoint that I want to, like, here's the thing, just let everyone talk for themselves, and then as a viewer, you can start to understand how these viewpoints get entrenched.
Right, and how they don't line up. I have a whole bunch of questions, so let me move along quickly. A couple things. I was really struck by the two black women jurors who, particularly the younger one, who really used the question of isolation and sequestering and the suffering that I think that caused as an explanation for her, not the verdict per se, because she did say we evaluated, we had all night every night. I'm wondering, go ahead, say, go ahead, yeah. No, I thought I was gonna say that you may have something right away to say about it. But I was really struck by the way that sequestering may have played a role in unexpected sort of consequences. Was there more material about that came out that didn't make it in, or what did you think of that aspect of the process?
No, I mean, I think that sort of what is in there in terms of what Yolanda said, who was the younger one, and Carrie, who's the older one, speaks to about as much as that was, again, of the thousands of things within this to sort of think about,
right.
And again, with knowing that then I wasn't so focused on the trial,
right.
that I didn't sort of talk that much more to them. I think what they said about being sequestered, you got what you needed to get. From Yolanda, it was, it's still one of my favorite moments in the film when I sort of challenge her the notion of, like, you guys deliberated for 3.5 hours, like, with all this, and she's just like looks at me dead in the eye, and she's, and didn't, like, well, went back to my room every single night. She's like 266 nights.
Yeah, she says, how many nights?
She's like, it's 266 nights.
Right.
So, and it's like, she's like, what do you? I was alone by myself thinking about this they were in prison.
Right. Well, this to me is a fascinating sort of example of the illusion of this kind of pure deliberative process that we in the West have produced. The idea that the law is just a set of objective facts, and you're alone in isolation, and you'll come to a clear, obvious truth once you've had proper time to deliberate. As if there's of course, what the film does is contextualize all that. And in fact, this felt like it gave an opportunity for people to feel unable to really address it, right? Not more able.
Well, or it's just one more thing that speaks to when you think of our jury system, and again, how the defense team especially bent over backwards to get a certain pool of jurors. They're all human beings,
right?
And so just as their experience is going to affect how they saw that case, where they're from, how they experience police themselves, so is putting them in a room for 9 months.
Yeah.
At a certain point, they're just going to get tired, and it's like, I want to go home.
Yeah.
So by the time, they were there for 9 months, and so that's going to affect how they sort of thought that out.
Right.
And if they didn't understand that, that's, in terms of the prosecution or whomever, and how that would, sort of affect their decision, like, that's on them.
Yeah, well, that may be true. But I do think it speaks to the broader, so it's an indictment of the system itself in terms of the content.
Oh, I think this entire case is an indictment of the system itself.
Yeah, but I mean, this felt like something people could have sort of not paid attention to, which is why I like the attention there. You think that's a very long time to be alone in a room. And I'm not sure guilt or innocence would have been the first thing on my mind.
Well, that's where, that's also, I love the juxtaposition of the two of them, which is, again, that speaks to the way that I think, I'll say the collective we, being like, oh, look, it was an all-black jury. Well, it's not an all-black jury. There was 9 black people on the final jury. And it's like, well, it's a bunch of black women who voted to just acquit the black guy.
Right.
Kind of thing. And you're like, well, there are 8 black women, and here are 2 black women. They think completely differently.
Right.
And I think that was really important to show. And, then again, so when you have Carrie just being like, we had to go home. But that's it. We had to go home. And that says it all. There's nothing more to say. Yolanda sort of took it to a place of like, look, there's nothing else. What else was I going to think about? I actually thought this through because I couldn't do anything else.
Right.
Carrie's just like, I don't give a shit.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, there was a lot of truth telling in that. But so let's. I want to push on the gender dimension for a minute since we just came out of the 2 jurors. I was struck both at the time and then again reliving it, watching it, by how complicated the gender dimensions of the racial dynamic were. And I'm wondering, I'll say a little bit more about it and then just pipe in at any point. But I guess, having read a lot about, gender violence and the particular sort of psyche, particularly for those who don't admit that they are batterers and abusers, I was struck by how little anybody really spoke to that kind of a sort of either an illness or practice or, form of violence that has a specific kind of trope. Now, you did a great job, I thought, of sort of looking at the family and the friends and to figure out how they experience this dichotomy of relationship. But I guess I'm wondering, we talk so much about this being a story about race, but not even the ways in which gender matters. I mean, the racial rage at OJ was also attached to the gendered racial dynamics of him marrying a white woman, and the history of that is also long. But I'm just wondering, has anyone asked you much about the gender dimensions? Did you think about how to tell the story around domestic violence and how that might have been, an important part of in other words, you didn't just go kill a person in the street, right? It was part of a certain type of gendered violence.
I mean, yes, and in some ways I thought my responsibility, I mean, again, this speaks to how the film's almost 8 hours long, and it could be however long you want to make it, and, there's a level to which I felt that my burden in telling the story was to, as well as possible and as closely as possible, at least examine and explain the specific dynamic of violence that took place between the two of them, to help sort of understand where this crime sort of came from and sort of his capability of this, and again, in the powerlessness that she felt, certainly and weirdly in how I was telling the story, almost in line with, in a very strange way, that, sort of the going back and forth in the second part of the film between her experience and the experience of Black citizens at the hands of the police, and sort of, again, the helplessness of her in this house at the hands of him, and every time someone, and that was a meaningful sort of juxtaposition. As far as the sort of further explanation or exploration of sort of the gender violence, in some ways, I don't know that there was much more I could have done beyond, because the one determinant for me in telling the story was to tell the story through the lens of these people who experienced it and who knew him and or her.
Right.
And there wasn't going to be any sort of third person sort of experts talking about this. You could talk about this and examine it and discuss it for days. That wasn't what I was doing.
Right.
I was sort of, the burden for me, ultimately, in trying to explain what happened during that trial was rooted on a different sort of plane.
Yeah.
And that was a secondary plane in terms of the story I was telling. It doesn't make it any less relevant.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of where you got it, in terms of how much it was focused on in the story. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
You are. It's just, I think, watching it and reading parts of her diary, I mean, the footage you had was amazing. I mean, I don't know, I'm not sure how that happened, but if there's a magic trick to that, you should share that with us too.
It's called really good archival research.
Yeah, well, that is a magic trick, actually. But there's some of that you had to get access to, right? You had to get permission. It's not just hard work, it's also access. But reading her diary, right, and thinking, about how many times, she basically felt her life was a danger, and then you really wonder, it raised questions about, well, this is my thing, how do you stop something horrible from happening? It's just my own psyche. But, what would have been the ways in which either the people around her or, in other words, if you think about the way race shaped everything that happened, it's an interesting thing to do the same meditation on how gender and power and masculinity
and primary to that to me, and this is where, again, I'm sort of hamstrung by the voices I have.
Right, no.
These are questions for her family.
Yeah.
And they don't have any interest. I mean, again, in her younger sister Tanya, who's in the film, she doesn't know and doesn't have much to say.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of those questions sort of, and again, you're also talking about the most private of things.
Yeah.
Who actually had access. There's a reason why sort of this information existed in her diary and diary alone. She had her own life that she was sort of keeping secret and was protecting, and her children that she was protecting, and so it's a very hard thing to get at.
Yeah.
And so I feel like we got at it as well as we could.
You did, yeah. No, I know. It just, once I read those pieces and saw the timeline, it was just sort of I wanted to be able to pipe in some sort of feminist analysis, like, hey, right here.
So type in, what's the?
Well, well, it's a little late now. The award, you already won the Academy Award, but I don't want to ruin the film. But no, I just think the combination of her desires for a family, this kind of fantasy of keeping a family together, when it was clear she was dealing with someone, given, if the diary is in any way true, and this is an if then, but let's just take that as a fact, it's a fairly, shocking wish, right? So there's a whole history of people who are classic victims of domestic violence, of imagining that this is going to stop, and that, that this is this temporary explanation, a kind of, participation through sort of psychological and other forms of domination. So there was that as one key piece. But then I was really struck near the very end when, again, I'm terrible, I'm so busy thinking while I'm watching, I don't pay attention to the who, but one guy says that he was, no matter, I think he was the guy who got him into the country club maybe. Anyway, he said that, there's all these, when OJ talks about Nicole, he's exasperated with her. Now this is after she's been long dead, right? He's exasperated, he's sort of explaining why he had a right to be frustrated with her. And I thought about like the psyche of a batterer around the justification and the fact that he's still narrating this justification.
Which goes back to me, the most salient detail of all this is that, she was 17 years old when he met her.
Yeah.
And so that her entire experience of being in a relationship as an adult was formed within this dynamic.
Yeah.
And there was a sense that, again, whether it's the gender dynamic or the racial dynamic getting flipped on its head when you talk about the hierarchy and the patriarchy of our country, and that he evolved to a point of truly believing that he owned this person, that her entire life was something, he gifted it to her.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's where that dynamic came from, and speaks to what you're saying.
Yeah, and maybe the family, I'm talk about full out speculation at this point, but maybe the family ultimately, felt culpable for, being sort of, if it were my daughter, I'll tell you right now, I would be very, what did I not do that made this dynamic so possible? And so maybe this is one of the reasons why they didn't really participate.
Tanya Brown, who we interviewed, was very sort of snippy about the notion that, my father was, helped out by OJ, who, he had a Hertz dealership that OJ got him, and, in many ways, OJ, as being told by more than one person, they were dependent upon him financially.
Yeah.
And so that sort of spoke to maybe how much they chimed in or didn't.
Yeah.
I don't, it's hard to know exactly the truth. She says that's absolutely not the case, but, the answer, I'm sure they do.
Yeah. That's hard. So I'm just gonna ask a couple more questions and then we'll open it up because I wanna make sure we have time for more things, so get your brains ready. Let's talk a little bit about archives. You can't come to a campus and talk to a professor and not talk about archives. So talk a little bit about how you approach them. Again, you contextualized it in such a multifaceted way. How did you think about these archives? Did you just dive in and wait and see what happened? Did you hire 100 people to give them little pieces of each? What was your strategy? What was your vision?
Archive in terms of just literally the footage in the film?
The footage, the newspaper clippings, the historical analysis.
Essentially, yes. In some ways, I might have been tasked, I was tasked with making the film and conceiving of what's going to happen, and so, but I know that you can't make a film by yourself, and so immediately I called my friend Caroline, who's an incredible producer and has a background as an incredible archival producer, and said, all right, so I'm going to do this thing, do you want to do this with me? And I sort of had to sell her on doing it, because she had the same idea that I had, why do you want to do anything about OJ? What is there to say? But as soon as she came on board, I already understood that there was someone who, that's her department. Between her and, we found a woman named Nina Christic, who's an incredible archival researcher. So the answer is, first of all, find people who know what they're doing in terms of accessing things. Secondly, then you just map it out in terms of, it's both a micro and macro exercise. There's some things that, you start doing your own research and I already understand what is accessible. If you're wanting to tell a scene, I'm going to talk about the USC-UCLA game in 1967. Yeah, there's going to be footage of that, I understand that. more like what's the best way to source that, where's the best footage to get.
Right.
But you're doing a deep dive. First of all, it's like we're telling a story about the history of the LAPD. So that's like unlocking we actually unlocked the LAPD archives. We convinced them to let us go and get footage from them that they hadn't. I think that they've had a bad sort of run in terms of PR, and so I think we come there and we're very respectful and respectable people when we tell them what we're trying to do. And we say, well, look, we're trying to tell a story about the history of the department. We want to talk about William Parker. We want to, and they let us go in the archives and transferred footage for us.
I can't believe that. Okay, so next time I need archives, I'm calling you. But so I don't understand. So were they happy with what you did with their footage, or do you not know?
But here's the thing: you got to realize it's not like somewhere someone said okay, but also we're dealing with the guy who runs his archive. And he's thrilled that someone's not like can we go through this and can we use this stuff that so for him, he wants this stuff.
He's a librarian who just happens to be in a police department.
And I do think the LAPD specifically, I'll say that there's a level of desired transparency, I think, that exists in 2015, 16, that didn't exist 25 years before. This is a different space that they exist in now. So in that way, I have to give them credit for being, it's like history is what it is.
I don't know. I got a grumpy answer for that one. You want
a
grumpy counter for that
Sure.
one? I just think they figured out no body cameras, they can spin the narrative. They can actually they can be transparent and still have the same outcome. But that's just
but how could their reputation among a certain group of people be any worse?
Well, there's that too.
So
That's that. But there is, yes, that's true too. But I still think that you're right. There's more transparency, but mainly not because I think they're more accountable, honestly, but because I think they realize that they can kill people with footage, and it's still okay. All the footage here. Look at it. Feel free.
I'm not.
Yeah,
we're aligned and we
Yeah.
agree. I happen to think, and I'm not sort of out to defend the LAPD. I do think Charlie Beck's LAPD is far different from,
Than it was.
Yes.
No, without a
than
doubt,
Charlie Bates's LAPD.
and everyone's not a terrible cop, it's not that, it's more the culture that enables certain things.
But so that might be the most surprising, but the answer to your question is there are, myriad sources that, that, by the way, and there's no method, everything's different. In terms of how you find things, how you convince said people,
right, and then what you do with it,
and what you do with it once you get it, and so it might have been that's accessing an archive. There are people who had footage that it's oh, how do we get this from you? And that's people who were characters in the film.
Right.
That's both convincing them.
Tremendous interview.
And it's how do you get people to talk to you? And then once they get talk to you, well, what do you have? Oh, okay.
Right.
How do you it's how do I get the crime scene photos? That's through months and months and months and months of being stonewalled by Bill Hodgman and the prosecutors. I'm not talking to you. There's looking back, it's all sort of the leap of faith that was this entire exercise in terms of having no reason to think anybody would talk to us, and the patience that you have to sort of have to when everyone says no, when you keep kind of having to sort of scale a wall that's been built through because of the media and what it has wrought over the 20 years, all these people who call people up every anniversary that said they're doing something in the story. So to get in the door at all was very difficult.
Right.
And so for someone like Bill Hodgman, it took 3 meetings with Gil Garcetti, who I only got an email from through a family friend, who finally said yes because of his son convinced him. He's the mayor of Los Angeles, but only because he said yes. And Bill Hodgman goes, okay, I will have an off-the-record conversation with you.
Right.
And then you do that, you get a chance to talk face-to-face.
Right.
He goes, oh, you see it, okay, I get what you're trying to do.
Right.
Again, finally, then he goes, well, I'm gonna give you a presentation before I even will submit to an interview. And he gives a presentation that he still gives to law enforcement to this day, going through the night of the crime and what happened. And it's in that half hour, I'm sitting there with one of our producers, where the last image he shows are these photos. And I was at that point, I was completely inured to everything about this. I was I'm just trying to get this done.
Right.
And that was shook me up in a way. I was oh,
that's what happened.
That's what happened, and that's what needs to be seen to understand the gravity of what happened.
Right.
And then it's right, how do I get these from you.
Can I make a copy?
Yeah, and then that, but that's sort of like, you have a sort of conversation, then you do an interview, and
Right.
again, he sort of is more comfortable with how, then you say,
Mhm.
look, this is
It's a
important to what you're
relationship.
saying, and then like, so
Right.
every single thing, and that's what makes it so exhausting.
Yeah.
Because and when you're doing
Yes,
something that is this
definitely.
long, there's just that much more stuff, there's that many more dynamics, there are that many more things, everything's a little mini battle.
Right, and that makes it, so it's almost like a human archive, more than a traditional archive, when you think of it, because it was, getting to the archive wasn't just about finding it and sitting there with microfiche, it was more about unlocking a sort of human man, woman archive, right?
And that's right. And there's, by the way, there's a very also specific mechanical exercise. We had 3 editors and they're working and I'm doing God knows what, either sitting with one of them or I'm preparing for a shoot and I'm thinking about this sort of something on at this level, and they're in touch with every day. They're emailing with our, with Nina and someone who's working with her, being like, I need this, I need that.
Right.
To help be very specific to the
Right.
scene that they're cutting. So it's not only sort of that we have this stuff already that we're accessing,
Yeah.
but then, so it's a constant exercise.
Right, and
Never.
in under 2 years, you must have been working around the clock.
We worked a lot.
Yeah, wow. Well, I'm gonna leave some time, I really have at least 5 more questions, but I'm gonna hold them in case you all don't have any. Oh, so much for that wish and dream, okay. I don't have a microphone, is there supposed to be one?
We can.
I'm happy, I don't know what they're recording and,
Can people stand up in their desk?
okay, so I'm gonna start over here and then I'm gonna come around, so yes, right.
So I'm mixed race. My father's of West African descent. My mother's of Eastern European Jewish descent. And I worked on a film called The Force, which is about police brutality in Oakland. And the director was multiracial. And
Peter Nix.
Yeah, Peter Nix. And we talked a lot about his race in relation to that sort of storytelling. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how your experience as a multiracial individual in America kind of played into your exploration of this narrative that's so racially polarizing.
It's a good question, not a simple question. I mean, actually, in some ways, it's a simple answer in the sense that, like, I don't mean to be like, we are who we are, and so, like, it's hard to separate my experience from how I would sort of tell the story. I mean, I've thought about it a lot recently from the conversation of when we talk about the lack of diversity in filmmaking in general, and sort of how that affects stories that get told. And in this case, it's specific to how this story got told. I mean, there is many people who have made films about OJ or done something about OJ, and all of a sudden people are like, oh my God, look at this, you put in all this context and this history, and I'm like, well, that's just, when I looked at the story, that's what I saw. That's what was brought to bear during that trial, and that's what was very fundamental to what I thought needed to be, that's what I understood it to be, based on who I am, before I even like dove deeply into it. And so the idea that people have been so fixated on finding out more information about what happened on June 17th, 1994. I'm like, I think we know enough, about sort of, we have enough evidence, but clearly there's something that's been missing in this conversation. And I think that speaks to, if nothing else, in terms of being biracial versus being black, I mean, I don't know, does that sort of, I mean, there's I actually don't know, because I can't talk about how people experience me. And I can't talk about sort of in terms of the ability to access different groups of people and being in a room and interviewing a black person, understanding sort of my experience and how they're more comfortable with me based on how I'm engaging them. And I can't speak to how white people experience me. And in terms of how I'm telling the story, if somehow they're comfortable with me in a different way based on sort of who I am, how I look, how I talk, I have zero idea. I just sort of speak to it based on my experience and also what I'm interested in, which also has to do with who I am from a racial standpoint. That's why I think someone chose me to make the film in the first place, and that's why I made the film when I did.
Interesting. But it also helps when your mom's marrying Red Edelman,
Well, okay, I'll tell you, but no, it doesn't.
It hurts.
I mean, well, that's
neutral.
Well, I mean, I don't know how you mean that in the sense that I grew up in a house that sort of was focused on issues of criminal justice, so I have a very keen understanding of that dynamic and nothing else. But I'll say one funny thing, which is like I was interviewing Danny Bakewell, who is a civil rights activist, a local civil rights activist in Los Angeles. And, I had reached out to him at a certain point where, again, this was, I don't know, halfway to 3/4 of the way through this process of shooting interviews. And again, somewhere where, that's a case where understood I needed a certain voice, and I actually wanted to interview this guy, John Mack, who was the head of the Urban League, and
Right.
wanted nothing to do with OJ. And so he was just like, no. And at a certain point, it was like, people were like, what about Danny Bakewell, who I'd seen in footage and all this. All this being said, we put out a request to Danny Bakewell. I didn't do it, and he says yes, and we show up at his, he now is actually runs, or was the owner of the LA Sentinel. So it's like at his office there, the black newspaper in Los Angeles. Probably an hour through this interview, and I'm asking him about coming to LA from the South and all these issues. And he just looks at me like we had a break or something, and he was like, what is this about? Like, why are you interested in all
What's
this?
this got to do with OJ?
And he basically was like, why are you interested in all this?
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't know, because this is the story I'm telling. He's like, no, why are you interested in this? And at a certain point, my producer, who I was with, Tamara Rosenberg, just
go tell me.
and I was like, well, and I said, well, my mother is so upset. And he's like, and that was it. And he was like, oh, I get it.
Right, well, that part of what I meant when I said it helps when your mom's marrying Ezra Edelman is that, you grew up not just in a multiracial or biracial family, but with people who were attuned and acutely aware of the way race is operated. That's not automatically the case. People get married, fall in love, get married, and then say, my kids are race-free, I don't know what the world is trying to continue. There are different ways of responding, but you had a context of deep awareness of the lived experience and how race mattered for that.
And at least in my household, the way that happened was through, not to be sort of use a trite word, but like osmosis. It was just sort of experience
right.
based on understanding who they are and what
Right.
they talk about. It wasn't like sort of pedantically, sort of drilled into me in any
Right.
way. And so that's where, again, I can't say, I was like, I don't know, I am me.
Yeah.
Can't explain it more than that.
Well, that's 2 thumbs up for osmosis. Okay, gentleman in the front here.
This is just like a student festival. Like when I watched your documentary, I was like, this is on ESPN. Like I never watch ESPN. My little brother does. Can you speak to sort of like how you use the Brian Lair show and ESPN to sort of like tell these greater stories or?
Wait, what's the Brian Lair show?
Ryan Gump.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Oh, never mind, go ahead.
I apologize. Or just how you use your passion for sports and ESPN as a platform to tell these greater stories.
Well, what I'll say is, because maybe I'm going to reserve talking about that a little later, but I think what was, in the end, really interesting about this, again, getting back to the divisiveness of this story and the politics that are sort of within it, that it ended up being incredibly subversive in my mind that it was ESPN that commissioned it, because especially where we are culturally, I mean, again, it's not sort of, the fact that everyone looked at the election last year, we haven't been this divided since OJ trial. And it's like, well, ESPN's the one sort of people, everyone loves sports. I mean, you might not love sports, but everyone loves sports. And so black, white, rich, poor, Jew, Gentile, and it's like, oh, you can put a film on with this sort of the political undercurrents on a station that everyone goes to watch for the same reason, and you have an audience that if it were put on a different sort of station, people might on the right or on the left be like, I'm not watching this. I understand what this is. And so I think that there's a level to which we are able to access much more people and a greater audience who think they're watching something that is going to be sports programming or something, and it's not. And so I think in a weird way, as much as, they've been great, and it's the audience, I mean, it's like, it wouldn't be my chosen vehicle, frankly. But in the end, it was the ideal place for this to show, because I think more people, again, to the point of people who didn't understand, people who had entrenched perspectives, all of a sudden there are people with those competing perspectives watching this thing jointly.
Yeah.
And I think it actually had an impact.
Yeah, without a doubt. Yes.
So last year was a really great year for documentary films with I'm Not Your Negro, the 13th and your film as well, all being nominated for Oscars, which all really talked about issues of race and race in America. What do you think specifically about the style of documentary filmmaking in that genre is lending itself to telling these really immense, intimate stories about race today?
Well, I think that those 3 films existed this year and were all nominated for Oscars, and there was there was, and that Roger Ross Williams, who made Life Animated, is also an African-American director. I think it's, frankly, a coincidence. I mean, if nothing else, it's nice that there was an audience that for 3 very well-made films that were sort of, and maybe, had an increased urgency in this time and place. But I don't know that I assign that much import to it. I mean, Raoul was making a film over the course of the last 10 years about James Baldwin. And so that it sort of came out this year, and it was perfectly timely. And then, I think the great thing is someone like Ava, by dint of, sort of the force of her personality and who she is one of the few people who could make a movie about mass incarceration and, have it sort of have the platform that it did. And so I think it's very unique to the specific examples, and that sort of, they all came out during the same time. It was a coincidence.
It could be that people were, also, nominating and giving more attention. I mean, the question is really also, what other films have been made over the past 5 years that didn't make it to nomination? Because the reason for nomination is both the excellence of the film, but then there's obviously politics, so I guess that plays a role. Are there any other hands? I was going to get 2 more? Okay, this very excited person. Yes.
Hi, could you share your thoughts on the FX drama and how you think it is similar to your own, how you would juxtapose your work against it, and what differences between the dramatic medium again and the documentary?
Very short answer, haven't seen it.
Did you see any, did you watch any films on OJ before? You
Not really.
did footage and you just stayed
No,
with
not really. I think I watched a couple things that were like, there was like I watched some, like this Discovery, this ID Discovery, I watched some of the stuff that was sort of representative of a genre that I was not interested in. Like sort of a weird investigative take on, let's take you here and go through these things. I was like, okay, that's not, I kind of got a sense of what existed.
So did you watch, can I piggyback on it's a really good question. Did you watch other types of formats for telling stories that were helpful to you that weren't about OJ?
In general, no. I think that
Did you watch anything?
Well, it's like how do you get, it's like, again, part of it is that, yes, I watch a lot of things in some ways, like where do you get inspiration?
Right.
And where do you also sort of protect yourself from not copying, and not being influenced by things. And so there was a year that, I didn't watch the show for a lot of reasons, was because everyone has been asking me about it, and the last thing I wanted to do was be put in a position where I'd have to lie and say, oh yeah, I think it's great, when maybe I don't think it's great.
Yeah, you don't want to get in that.
I hear it's good, but I also, frankly, didn't want to watch it because I also was envious of things that you could dramatize that I couldn't do in a documentary. Like they could sort of explore, a dynamic between Johnny Cochran and Chris Darden that I couldn't do because Johnny Cochran is deceased and Chris Darden wouldn't be in my film. And it was painful for me, the thought of watching something that I really desperately wanted to talk about and discuss.
Yeah.
So I was like, I'm not going to touch that.
Yeah.
There was also these things concurrent to, our film coming out, Making a Murder, The Jinx, all these things. So people immediately was like, well, you made this incredible true crime documentary. And I'm like, but I don't really look at this as a true crime documentary.
It has that dimension.
And so I haven't watched Making a Murder. I have watched The Jinx.
Mm-hmm.
In my relationship with The Jinx, though, was pretty funny because I watched the first episode of The Jinx because I was curious. I was curious formally about how they were doing it. So I remember watching the first episode and seeing the beautiful recreations combined with more classic documentary techniques of taking a subject to a location. They were doing it all in a way that it was like, I can't do all, I don't have the know-how nor the budget to do these things. So I remember being really like, okay, this isn't for me.
Yeah.
And then even worse, so I put it away. And then there was the Sunday that was 6 weeks later, I suppose, where I was in Los Angeles for a shoot, and I get, an alert on my phone from a New York Times update being like, Robert Durst, accused murder, admits in The Jinx to have committed the murders, and I was like, fuck, great. So now you make a movie about a guy who everyone believes committed murder, and he admits he was the murderer at the end of it. I was like, why are you gonna do that?
Yeah.
So you might as well just not gonna pay attention.
Okay, we have time for one more question. This woman here.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the differences in your creative process that you've experienced or are experienced in developing scripted versus non-scripted, highly political projects.
Well, I haven't done any scripted.
Well, I was reading a bit about the Richard It's your jewel project working out with Jonah Hill, and if you had anything to say about that.
It doesn't exist yet, so it's not something for me. So I can't speak to that in terms of, I can try to answer a question on process that's not, so I don't know.
It's okay, someone else can ask a question.
Yeah, all right, that's okay, next time, yes?
I'm curious because you were saying that you experienced it as a child college student, and now there's probably only like a handful of people, even in this room, who were alive when it happened. And to kind of add some context, is there like a modern athlete who you think would be like comparable to have such like an earth-shattering moment in their perception? And also, was you and your team who are obviously older aware that your experience of documentary did really the fundamental like shaping the viewpoint of like a whole new generation of people who never actually got the chance to have an independent experience with it?
Well, to answer your second question, I mean, I think that while I was sort of more fixated on telling a good story in a way that would be revelatory and worthwhile, I think there was a part of it that was, I understood that if you were under a certain age, whether it's college stage students but I really looked at almost like people under 30, who sort of had no idea about who OJ was before the murder trial. And I that did sort of was a little bit of a motivating principle to sort of explain who he was and show him in all his glory, to understand how the cultural space that he occupied, because I think that has been completely lost. And so in that way, I was very aware, and that was purposeful and helpful, by the way, in just knowing you're sort of going to go have this participate in this undertaking that was going to be so immersive and time consuming. You want to make sure that it is worthwhile.
Yeah.
And there are people who are getting something out of it beyond those of us who sort of followed it during the trial and or lived through it before. As far as the first thing, getting back to almost the first thing we're talking about, I think OJ is, from the time and place and who he is and what he represented, from where he came from to where he got to, all these things it's unique. And I think that the culture we live in, sure, if LeBron James was accused of murder, in 20 years, it would be real shocking. But we don't have exactly the same relationship with OJ. OJ was the first. He broke the mold. He sort of walked through a door that a black athlete and ingratiated himself to white America and was embraced by white America, and sort of had a personality and a friendliness to him that, again, it's sort of like, again, I'd almost feel like, oh, it'd be LeBron. Oh no, but it'd be kind of Steph Curry because of the way that the way he is. Like, there's no.
But even in this case, those two athletes have spoken out about inequality in society and social issues.
Well, right, this is
OJ was like, don't even come to me with that.
That's right. And so, that's actually been a wonderful thing to have gone through this process, and the continuum of that sort of started with, when you go back, and again, it's like the post-Jackie Robinson era of athletes sort of been speaking out or not speaking out, and to get to OJ, and then to see this sort of pendulum finally swing back to where it is now has been a lovely thing to see.
Definitely. Well, if there's not a burning short? You sure? Go ahead. No, I think we have, because we kept it in. I think we're right on time. We have time for one more. Yeah. You almost lost your spot there.
I think Dr. Rose brought up sort of the intersection of gender violence and race, and we talked about it a little bit. But coming into the story, did you feel some sort of responsibility to tell the story of the OJ trial and the murder of Cole and the murder of a white woman, while also recognizing America's not only relationship with race, but specifically its relationship with black men and their relationship with white women, and sort of the toxic way that America's treated black men in that regard, and tell the story that involves Emmett Till, and making sure that story gets told and not lost in the story of OJ. And how did you sort of navigate that?
I'm sort of going to fall back on the what I've been saying. The answer is yes. I was very cognizant of it. How you sort of, there's a lot of things that you might have an ambition to sort of flesh out when you're telling a story, and in terms of how it plays out, and sort of the images that get used. There's an image of Emmett Till at the end of the film, vis-a-vis the actual sort of result of the trial. For some ways, some things that are very prominent in your brain, as far as I'm going to talk about this, I'm going to try to elucidate this in some form, sometimes turns into a shot. One thing, one reference, and that's as much as sort of the thing can bear, and it's still sort of, giving, some, it's more than, more than just, a wink to it, but it's like all these things are part of this, very rich stew. And if there could have been a way that conversation could have been, but again, that's what also ends up happening. It ends up being more of this conversation on an analytical level that is harder to do in the way that I was hoping to tell the film.
Right.
So sort of tell the story. And so there are a couple of references to it. Honestly, maybe not as much as I would have hoped. And in some ways, like, I ended up sort of being very comfortable with the places that we got to, with all the themes that we explored, sort of vis-a-vis what I hoped to do at the beginning.
I thought that theme was addressed in a couple of other ways, which is, I thought, where we started out about the post-civil rights era of a certain kind of imagination about transcending that dynamic. But then near the end, when the journalist who was assigned to write the sort of pariah story says that, the rage at OJ, was very clearly a racial rage in a specific racial gendered context. And it wasn't just that he betrayed them, it was the context of that betrayal. It doesn't go, as you said, it's more a snapshot, more of a moment.
Mm-hmm. It's like, it's sort of weird to sit here and realizing that I'm like needing to jog my own memory about these specific spaces. I sort of, it's in there, it's in Sylvester Monroe, who's the Washington Post, Black Washington Post writer during the trial, being like, if OJ had, killed Marguerite, this wouldn't have been the same thing. Clearly the fascination, and the history of sort of violence and the sort of this fear of the black male, in general, but vis-a-vis white women, to me, is a clear undercurrent throughout the whole story, and in terms of how it gets played out. The other thing is, sometimes where, you're trusting an audience who have lived in the country to understand the dynamic that's happening in a way that you don't necessarily have to sort of completely over-explain it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think with that, that's one place where that, I think, existed.
Yeah. All right, I think our time is up. I looked at my watch, and I'm sorry it is, but thank you all for coming. Ezra, thank you.